Okay, everybody, why don't we get settled? We have a terrific program here and on this very special occasion, so I want to get us started. And thank you all for coming here for this very special, sober and sad in some ways, but also celebratory occasion to pay tribute to our extraordinary friend, colleague, and mentor, Bill Zartman. I know with everybody here, most of what I will say is very familiar, but I want to begin and express my appreciation to Marie Danielle and Alex. They weren't able to be with us in person, but I think they're joining us remotely, and express both our condolences and our appreciation for the enormous contribution that Bill has made, not just to SAIS and Johns Hopkins through an extraordinary career, but also to the world as a whole. You know, the connection that Bill had to to Johns Hopkins was incredibly deep. I only just recently learned that his father was a professor of physics at Hopkins and part of the APL here at Hopkins. So the connection went back even further and deeper than I had recognized. And we know that Bill himself did his degree work here, so the connection throughout his career was a very strong one. But we especially are here, of course, to celebrate the amazing contribution that he made beginning in the early mid-1980s when he came back to SAIS and to Hopkins to teach and to do his extraordinary work here. He played an extraordinarily important role in the life of SAIS. All of you know the incredible contributions he made as a leader of both the Africa Studies program and the Conflict Management program, both of which have been pioneering efforts and have very strong legacies that have continued to this time at SAIS. And it's an effort that he made not only in his own contribution, but to generations of scholars and students who followed him and who were, led and inspired by him to work in these fields. And several of them are here with us today. His work, I'm obviously not be surprised to know, much more familiar with his work on conflict management than on Africa, though we'll hear a fair amount about both in the course of the discussion this afternoon. But I can tell you, both as a scholar and as a practitioner, there are very few people who have had the kind of impact and insight that his work has had, not only in thinking in the academy and teaching about conflict management, conflict resolution, but for practitioners ourselves. And, for me, much of what I learned from him, I was in the position to actually see and put in use in practice. The most vivid case of which was my own personal involvement in the Northern Ireland peace process, which I had the privilege of working alongside President Clinton, George Mitchell, and many important leaders in Northern Ireland, in Ireland itself, and in the UK, leading to the Good Friday Agreement. And if ever an illustration of the insights and the work that Bill did, it was the process leading up to the Good Friday Agreement. One of the participants in that negotiation, Seamus Mallon, a very important figure in the political life of Northern Ireland, once referred to the Good Friday Agreement as a Stormont for slow learners. For those of you who know who the history, Stormont was the place where the Northern Ireland government met. And the agreement that was reached in the Good Friday Agreement was almost identical, not exactly identical, but largely identical to the proposals that were on the table in 1975 during the Stormont negotiations. And so in a piece that I wrote subsequent to this, one asks, why in 1978, 79, and not in 1975? And for all the reasons that Bill identified, which was that the nature of the situation in the conflict, the absence of a hurting stalemate, the absence of the ripeness of the negotiations made an agreement which was unacceptable to the parties in the mid-1970s, ultimately acceptable to the parties in 1979. There are very few scholars who can claim to have that kind of direct impact through the insights that their work has had. And so I'm personally very grateful for his contributions. I learned a lot from him. I had the privilege of knowing him some before I came to SAIS, and was grateful to, even after his retirement, that he continued to be involved with the conflict management program and conflict management activities here. So we've all benefited enormously from his work, and this sort of kind of perspective that he had that recognizes, we really emphasize here at SAIS, the importance of translating ideas into practice. I mean, that's what it's all about. And if ever there were an avatar of that perspective and that kind of contribution, it was Bill Zartman. So I want to thank Professor Vukovic, who a student of his and carrying on his enormous work, as well as my great friend Chet Crocker, who's with us today, and so many others who are in the program. It's going to be an opportunity to explore the incredible work that he's did, the incredible contributions he's made, and really to pay tribute to a giant. So thanks for being here.
Hi, well, good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see so many familiar faces, and from the guest list, so many other distinguished names who I have not yet met, but who I'm glad have joined us. I'm Peter Lewis, Vice Dean for Faculty Affairs and Research at SAIS, and for many years I was lucky and fortunate to succeed Bill as Director of the African Studies Program, and continuing to be engaged on the continent and in our program activities. Thanks to Jim for his comments and his reflections. I want to start with a few words about Bill. We are going to hear a lot about his scholarship today on Africa in general, across the continent, in the Maghreb, his focus on international relations on the continent, more broadly, his contributions to the field of conflict management and negotiations. It's a sprawling, ambitious, and really impressive legacy, remarkably impressive legacy that he's left us. But probably what is less known about Bill is that he was a real institution builder. First and foremost, I guess, here, at SAIS, where we know about his work. He built the African Studies Program, or developed it and advanced it quite substantially, founded the Conflict Management Program, and he both directed different programs, had an aggressive and fast-paced publishing schedule connected to those programs, supported travel, which we're seeing some of on the slides, and in just many ways was just a very a constant presence in panels, presentations, engagement, program activities, and programmatic leadership. Obviously, he also did institution building with the Tunisia legation and a number of other research organizations and initiatives internationally. And so he really has had a huge presence in the academic standing and the growth of SAIS over a period of 4 decades. We are also, I think, all aware of his tremendous energy, his huge enthusiasm for life, through teaching, through writing, through a variety of engagement, and at his memorial and funeral service we heard about his many other interests in singing and culture and other areas of life. So he was really a true polymath and a very rich character, a rich person. And he was very welcoming and inspiring to me when I came to SAIS. It made it very easy for me to step into the program and program leadership. Really gave me a lot of advice and insight, and also inspired a lot of our program activities in the direction for African studies. So I'm moved and I'm excited to have this commemoration of his work, his intellectual contributions, and his prolific career. With that, I will turn to our keynote speaker and briefly introduce Chet Crocker. Chet Crocker is somebody who I doubt needs an introduction to the people here, but he has been a long-standing friend of SAIS, of the African Studies and Conflict Management programs, and a collaborator on many projects with Bill. Almost everyone in this room and watching online has probably read chapters of Taming Intractable Conflicts, Leashing the Dogs of War, or Grasping the Nettle among many other books. Ambassador Crocker is also a SAIS alum. He did his master's here in the 1960s and received his PhD from SAIS as well in international relations. Over the years, Chet has been a regular at many conflict management or African studies functions, making appearances and contributions to the negotiation practicum course, or being the moderator of a conflict management program discussion with Anthony Blinken, former Secretary of State under the previous administration, under the Biden administration. He was inducted into Johns Hopkins University's Society of Scholars in 2019, and finally, Chet has also been a significant donor to SAIS, in particular to the Conflict Management Field Trip Fund. His own illustrious career has encompassed many roles. He served as chairman of the U.S. Institute of Peace from 1992 to 2024, and from 1981 to 1989, he was U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs and a key mediator in the prolonged negotiations between Angola, Cuba, and South Africa that led to Namibia's independence and the withdrawal of Cuban forces from Angola. He also served as a staff officer at the National Security Council in the 1970s and Director of African Studies at CSIS. Chet is known for being the former James Schlesinger Professor of Strategic Studies at Georgetown's School of Foreign Service, but we won't hold that against him. And something else we won't hold against him is really just a personal note which I've shared previously with Chet. I recall as an undergraduate at Berkeley sitting in on campus to protest some of the Reagan administration's policies on South Africa. And this brings to mind Mark Twain's quote about parents. When I was 17, I was convinced my father was a damn fool. When I turned 21, I was astonished by how much the man had learned in 4 years. And indeed, through our long association, I've learned a great deal from Chet Crocker, and I much appreciate it. So please join me in welcoming Chet Crocker for his keynote address reflecting on Bill's career and impact.
Peter, thank you for that very kind introduction. It went on too long, but it was okay. It's a real honor to be asked to set the stage with these brief remarks. I asked Sanisha, how long is a keynote? And he said, 45 minutes an hour, or whatever. I promise it won't be that long. SAIS was Bill Zartman's home, and it's fitting that we're remembering him here and celebrating him here. There are people in this audience who witnessed Bill's work and profited from his many, many attributes, and people who worked with him and knew him certainly better than I did. So it's with some humility that I offer these introductory thoughts. I'll start with some general thoughts about Bill's contributions and then move on. But first are contributions in various fields that have been touched on by Jim and Peter. African studies, conflict management, international relations more generally. And then I'm going to offer some personal reflections about the connection that I had with Bill Zartman. And after that, what he meant to me. And after that, I'll move along to some specifics on his work on Africa, his role as an institution builder, and his depth of contributions to the field of negotiation and conflict management. An extraordinary record. So here are some characteristics about Bill Zartman's work. He turned the English language into a powerful, powerful tool of analytical insight. And his incisive wit really made a big difference. Bill eschewed the swamp of social science verbiage in favor of crystal clear metaphors and concise sentences. Most of them were concise. Not all of them, but most of them were concise. And evocative imagery to capture the essence of a problem. One thinks of his 3 patterns of negotiation during the end game. Never forget it: dueling, driving, and dragging. I'm looking at Terry in the front row here because Terry and Bill worked together with those concepts of end game negotiation. I don't need to remind this audience of his trenchant and powerful imagery, his ability to capture and boil a complex subject, bewildering phenomena down to their essence, defining the 3-stage negotiating process of diagnosis, formula, and detail, and then defining the things that third parties do in mediation: communicate, formulate, and manipulate. That's pretty stunning contribution right there. Now, Bill enjoyed discussion and debate. He was open to new ideas. He accepted codicils and refinements that were offered by some of his colleagues, but only after a hearty debate. Bill liked to sharpen a fuzzy proposition. Sometimes he made them into funny propositions. I like to think that Bill especially treasured the fact that practitioners instinctively understood what he was saying. Practitioners understood it better than some of his colleagues in the academy, even if some of those in the academy had methodological quibbles to offer. I think of Bill's career, I'm reminded of the experience of God when he or she applied for a grant from the National Science Foundation to create another world, but got turned down because there were no publications in peer-reviewed journals. There was a lack of quantitatively verifiable hypotheses, and he only did it once. Well, Bill Zartman had tons of peer-reviewed works, but my point remains that a creative scholar like Bill doesn't really need to have a clearly etched track record because he's the one who creates the track, right? So Bill's voluminous work on negotiation typically centered around the most basic concepts, and he wielded them with rare skill. The difference between raw power and leverage, for example. The critical variable of the level of commitment of parties and the asymmetry of their interests. The central factor of relationships between and within parties, and the central variable, as has been already mentioned, of timing in negotiation, its conditions and turning points. Now, Bill was never a diplomatic practitioner, really, although he was a track 2 practitioner and a very fine one, but he was never a track 1 practitioner in that sense. But it didn't matter. He was close to the ground. He was an observer and a close observer of policy and of policy makers, a perceptive observer of war, of conflict, of peacemaking, and of failures at peacemaking. It's impossible to stereotype or neatly categorize which box to put Bill Zartman in. As Fen Hampson, who's with us today, one of Bill's and my closest collaborators, has observed, Bill was not a constructivist, for sure. He was not a liberal internationalist, for sure. He was more or less of a realist in his appreciation of power and leverage, but he was also very sensitive to how parties learn and interact with each other, how they learn from each other, how their experience helps to determine their level of commitment as they enter into bargaining situations. A couple of personal anecdotes about my own relationship with Bill that I'll start with mentioning that 900 years after the Norman conquest of England, there was an Africa conference at SAIS. It was in the spring of 1966 at the Herder Auditorium at 1740 Mass Avenue, right? And we were introduced to the work of a budding young Africanist named Bill Zartman. who had just published a book which we saw recently on the screen called The International Relations of the New Africa, a seminal study of the inter-African conflict and compromises leading up to the creation of the Organization of African Unity. 60 years later, that book is still relevant. The book's front matter stated that he had already in 1966 written 3 books and co-authored 6. I can't imagine what the number is at this point. I don't even have that number. I'm sure somebody in our audience has that number. Bill's research had taken him all over northern and western Africa, traveling with Danielle in a 1955 de Chevaux. As a student in that audience, I was blown away by his mastery of African diplomacy. I'd never seen anything like it. As we know, Bill went on to lead the African Studies program at SAIS and as well as the conflict management program, which he shaped and really created. Now, fast forward 20 years, a not quite so young Bill Zartman asked for an appointment to see me at the State Department. He knew that our diplomacy in Southern Africa was becalmed. He knew why. He asked me who most needs an agreement, the South Africans, the Cubans, the Angolans, or the USA. I got the point. He then asked me if we had considered using deadlines or threats to quit the negotiation. I got that point too. A little later, I returned from a fruitless round of talks with the Angolans in Brazzaville and publicly stated that those talks had been a, quote, waste of time, unquote. I imagine that Bill was pleased. The Angolans were not pleased. They lost no time in going public themselves to declare that the meeting had been constructive and the negotiating process was in good shape and had a bright future. Bill was a role model. I had never trained in negotiation before joining the State Department. I stumbled into it by doing and by listening. When I returned to Georgetown and began absorbing the conflict management literature, light bulbs went off in my mind. Never so much as when reading Bill's work. I had thought that we in the State Department were the innovative geniuses who had done diagnosis and formula and detail. Bill, of course, had written about all that sometime previously. Bill was an adventurer and an explorer, as anyone who has traveled with him will know. I once had a 3-hour tour of Oslo with Bill after a meeting of the Oslo Mediators Forum. But it actually took 8 hours to do all the things that we did in 3 hours, because Bill took us to every gallery and museum in Oslo to see the Munchs and the Tiedemanns and the Kittelsons and the Bergmans and the Viking Museum and the Kon-Tiki Museum. We did all of this in 3 hours. We made our plane thanks to Bill's capacity for navigating the fast train service in Oslo. Bill loved to travel. He did a lot of travel. To explore conflict zones, to organize workshops, to take SAIS students to conflict zones, and to lead discussions of the PIN project in various European capitals, and of course to visit his adored Morocco and Tangier. Bill's work on African issues covers a vast range of interrelated topics: continental visions, inter-African diplomacy, conflict management itself, African traditional approaches to conflict management, African regional organizations, African boundary disputes, and associated legal doctrines. What may be less known is the extent to which Bill played a key role in documenting the efforts between 1991 and 2003 to stand up a more robust form of African regional organization, leading, of course, to the creation of the AU. Working with Sudanese scholar, activist, and statesman Francis Deng and former Nigerian President Obasanjo, he co-authored a book in 2002 called A Strategic Vision for Africa, the Kampala movement, which was started actually in Uganda in 1991. Anyway, fast forward, the African Union owes a big debt to the work of those three people, Bill Zartman, President Obasanjo, and Francis Deng. Bill was a champion and a believer in the importance of this highly important, though ultimately somewhat disappointing, milestone in African affairs. As Francis Deng describes in Bill's 2019 Festschrift by Springer, he and Bill developed the ideas of sovereignty and responsibility, which of course is the precursor to the R2P doctrine and the initiatives centered in Canada that led to the advocacy for the responsibility to protect. Another of his major focus areas was on conflict prevention in Africa, much reflected in his 2015 volume, Preventing Deadly Conflict, containing not only his own crisp analysis, but also a wonderful bibliography that includes some 20 references to his own work on that topic, African conflict prevention, including the wonderfully titled 2005 book, Cowardly Lions, Missed Opportunities to Prevent a Deadly Conflict and State Collapse. Bill protected no one. He didn't protect Americans, he didn't protect Africans, he didn't protect Europeans in his catalog of the guilty lions. Instead, he offered trenchant analysis of what has gone wrong with so many African states and what is therefore wrong with African regional institutions. He argued forcefully, and Terry Lyons, who's with us, insightfully remarked in a previous discussion of Bill's work, that a regional collapse is the result of the state collapse, and you can't fix regions if you don't fix states. So that's a lesson there that's really important. State building is the only way to restore capable regions. War and violence cannot be resolved regionally. Still less, I might add, can they be resolved internationally, unless the states are fixed. As Bill declared in the introduction to an earlier Festschrift by Rutledge in 2008, his journey into the field of negotiation and mediation and conflict management actually began in area studies, and I think that's an important part of his life. He was proud of his area studies roots, and he never left them. He stayed a long time in them. He began this focus with an early book on the negotiations between African states and the European Economic Community. Bill derived much of his theoretical understanding from detailed case studies, not only in sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa and the Middle East and many other parts of the world. Much of his narrative is laced with authoritative case examples, as those of you in the audience who have committed his work to memory will know. So I believe that what Bill did was to universalize the lessons that he derived from Africa, bearing witness to the phrase from Pliny and Aristotle, ex Africa semper allocat novi. Many people are familiar with the diverse elements of Bill's scholarship. Few have done a better job in summarizing it than Ellen Lapson, writing in the preface to the 2019 volume by Springer, which is called I, William Zartman, a Pioneer in Conflict Management and Area Studies. In that book, she and Francis Deng paint vibrant portraits of the man that we are honoring today. Central themes include his work in building programs at SAIS and in the European-based PIN network, his innovative teaching programs at SAIS that included engaging youngsters in the DC school system, as well as MA and PhD students, of whom there are a few here in the audience. Everyone who did an MA or a PhD with Bill Zartman, raise your hands. Wow. Bill took SAIS students with Terry Hopman to conflict zones such as Nagorno-Karabakh and the Philippines. He created his own universe, peopled by those he taught and advised, people whom he mentored and supported. He was among the most creative scholars I've ever encountered. Wrapping up now, because I'm looking at the clock and I don't want to go too long, the great majority of Bill's work was in the field in the area of the post-Cold War, as well as the Cold War itself. So from 1945 to about, let's say, 2010, was the focus of Bill's environment. These were time periods when there were ecosystems full of examples of tradecraft from which one could draw lessons, as he did. His many powerful insights, which will be discussed by our panels later on this afternoon, are good examples of what he did during these two periods, the Cold War and the post-Cold War. It's striking to me that those time periods had recognizable structures. It was therefore possible to identify who are the agents and what are the processes and what are the institutions that we're dealing with. Toward the end of Bill's career, we find, I think, an often saddened and discouraged Bill Zartman, a scholar who was superbly eloquent in identifying what was missing in the environment for negotiation, mediation, and conflict management today. He wrote with passion, perhaps even anger, of the age of entropy, which we are now living in. He saw that emerging some time ago. Writing in 2020 in the International Negotiation Journal, he observed that this new era featured an absence of structure within which to attempt peacemaking because everyone's incentive structure was just going to hell. My words, not his. Conflict countries had become the playground of wolves and jackals living off the land, immiserating their own people. And these places became arenas in which neighbors and outside powers actually aggravated the problems and differences, exploiting them, competing in them, running for a Nobel Prize in them, while casually accepting the impossibility of coherent UN action, except perhaps for humanitarian relief. No new structures were being built, and those that still existed were being abused and manipulated by self-interested local, regional, and global players. I'm not making this up. This is what Bill was writing in 2020, right? Bill's view of entropy in the conflict management field is deeply affecting. I have no doubt that Bill died a proud scholar who knew that he had shaped generations of scholars, students, practitioners, and warring parties. But I'm also certain that the world he was leaving behind saddened him, and he tired of cataloging what went wrong and what was missing. Let me share a brief quote from what he had to say in 2020. The current system of world disorder contains defining characteristics that do not fit well with established negotiation concepts and practice. He concluded that new concepts and practices of negotiation are required to deal with the current vacuums in international politics and their consequences. And he asked us all, in this current situation of entropy with its contextual and conflictual circumstances, how can effective conflict management be reintroduced? He concluded there are many proposals for a new world order on what the system should look like once we get the conflict management car running again. But the immediate challenge is what to do in the meantime to get that car started. A powerful phrase. That comes from international negotiation in 2020. In my conclusion, I think Bill would be very happy to know that we are having this session here today. He'd be happy to hear that we're going to be discussing his hugely consequential legacies of work on international negotiation and conflict management in Africa and around the world. This symposium is our tribute to Bill. Now we can explore in more depth how to live up to his hopes. For Bill was always a hopeful person who wanted to believe that things could be improved and that we have a responsibility to try. So let's try. Thanks for listening.
Well, we're going to continue our exploration into the legacy of this extraordinary person, Bill Zartman, by looking at his contributions or his shaping of the field of conflict management. And we have with us a really wonderful group of people who not only are giants themselves in this field of conflict management, but worked with Bill very, very closely at various stages in their career. Let me introduce myself first, because if you look at the agenda, I mean, it's a little bit misleading. I'm listed as senior advisor at the U.S. Institute of Peace, which I am not anymore, if any of you know what's happened to the U.S. Institute of Peace, and an adjunct professor at AU, which I'm not anymore. But my name is Pamela All, so that is right. And but let me introduce the speakers, and then I just want to say one word about Bill myself. I'm not going to go into the full biography because many of you know the people on the stage. And also, I hope they will, in their talk, make it clear where their intersections with Bill were at various points in their career. Lynn Wagner is the Senior Director of Tracking Progress Program at the International Institute for Sustainable Development, where she is working on the development and implementation of the SDGs. But she was also a PhD student of Bill Zartman, and has been a lifelong friend since that moment, and is now teaching his course here at SAIS. Sanisha Vukovic is the director of the MA program in global policy here at SAIS, and he is a senior lecturer here as well. Before that, he was associate director of the conflict management program and worked very closely with Bill and Terry and Dan Serwer during that time. Expert on mediation and conflict management, and like Len, has published a great deal in this field, sometimes with Bill. Fen Hampson joins us from Carleton University in Ottawa, where he is a Chancellor Professor and Professor of International Affairs at the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, and is the President of the World Refugee and Migration Council. Written lots of books, way beyond the conflict management field, Canadian foreign policy, and mediation, negotiation, and many other topics. He has known Bill, or he did know Bill for over about 36 years, but became very close to him after he joined the PIN group. So has also written a book with Bill called The Global Power of Talk, which is an excellent book. I've taught it a number of times, and it is a terrific book on negotiation. So I just want to say one word about Bill and the U.S. Institute of Peace. So I was at USIP for over 30 years. And when I got there, you have to remember that USIP was a new institution in a very young field. And not many people there knew very much about conflict resolution. They may have known about diplomacy and other various subjects, dancing around the conflict management field, but they actually hadn't had a background in conflict management. Bill was really the principal sort of teacher for USIP as we became much more familiar with the concepts of the field. I tried to go back and see how many books he published with USIP, but because of the website and the problems that we have, I couldn't do it for you. But he published enormously through us and really helped to put us on the map as the principal conflict management institution of the US government. So he's done so much here at SAIS and at other places to build institutions, but I wanted also to make that link with USIP because it was a very important one for us. So with that, I will turn to the panel. Lynn, would you like to start?
Thank you. I really feel that any discussion about Bill's contributions to the field of conflict management and resolution needs to include his role in fostering the development of the negotiation literature among the side, thinking about the signature concepts that he brought to the literature. In late July, an email exchange that I was on regarding the sad news of Bill's passing included many reflections on his contributions to the negotiation field. In one such message, Dan Druckmann, who I know is online right now watching this, wrote that one of Bill's enduring legacies is that he did the impossible, which was to bring our ragtag bunch into a durable intellectual community. And for that, he will always be our hero. So Bill fostered the development of the intellectual community of negotiation scholars in a number of ways. Dan was particularly reflecting on Bill's role in conceiving and editing a large number of edited book projects, many of which you're seeing photos of right now. Each of them brought together a variety of negotiation scholars to contribute chapters on a particular challenge related to negotiations. And thanks to these edited volumes, we now know more about power and negotiation. I think Sinisa will probably tell us, but spoiler alert, the negotiating party with the most resources doesn't always prevail in a negotiation. His book on peace and justice, Negotiating Forward and Backward-Looking Outcomes, argues that peace and justice are both critical in creating sustainable outcomes, and the right balance depends on the context. In a book on negotiating with terrorists, he examines the process of trying to align two completely polarized parties, while being careful not to advocate for such negotiations. The book highlights that it's essential for hostage negotiators to understand the terrorist culture, the hostage takers' profiles, their personality, and their view of the world, as well as the authorities' values in framing of the problem raised by the taking of the hostages. There are many more edited volumes, one of which, Getting It Done, Post-Agreement Negotiation in International Regimes, I'll say a bit more about in a few minutes. But these edited volumes helped bring new scholars into the field alongside the scholarship that they produced. In the messages that followed his passing, I saw many messages from people like myself who had grown up in the field by being invited by Bill to participate in one of these projects. And for that, he has really broadened the intellectual content of the scope of the field. In addition to this impressive list of publications, Bill was a founding member of the editorial board for the journal International Negotiation, which for the past 30 years has provided a publishing home for international negotiation research. Most of the issues of international negotiation are focused on a particular topic, thematic topic, with a guest editor. And it will be no surprise to all of you that Bill was the guest editor for 10 of the issues in international negotiation. For many years, Bill convened the Washington Interest in Negotiations group, which brought together many of the scholars in this room who worked in the DC area for brown bag lunches and to exchange research. And in this way, challenge each other by having and getting peer reviewed before publications took their full shape and were submitted for publication. Bill was a founding member of the Processes of International Negotiation group, the PIN group that's been mentioned a number of times already. So this international network was comprised of 12 steering committee members before his passing, and each of them intentionally came from a different country and represented many different academic traditions intentionally. Since its conception in 1986, the PIN Group has been the institutional home for approximately 40 edited volumes, most of which Bill had a contribution of one type or another. A final but no less important point about Bill's fostering of the negotiation literature is his contribution to conceptually defining the big tent for negotiation research. So he organized his international bargaining and negotiation class here at SAIS, and I continue to organize the class now that I teach it, according to the levels of analysis that he outlined in his 2009 article, which was published in the SAGE Handbook of Conflict Resolution. So according to these 4 levels, literature from international relations theorists on power relations among countries inform the structure of the negotiation. Economic analyses from game theorists inform the strategy of a negotiation. A variety of theorists, including his own work on formula details and ripeness, contribute insights into the process of the negotiations. And social psychologists inform research about the behavior and relationships between individual negotiators. And of course, their boundary spanning between all of these levels, but he really helped to define how the insights from these very different research traditions could be combined in this interdisciplinary field of inquiry. And those who knew his research well know that the behavioral level of inquiry was one on which he was very outspoken about the conceptual challenges for research in focusing on the individual negotiator as the analytical variable. In particular, he cautioned that using negotiators' culture risked stereotyping and losing the creativity that the individual may bring to the negotiation. And despite this long-running objection, he remained curious about how individuals could be conceptualized in negotiation research. And in his 2024 book with Sanisha on rethinking conflict resolution and management, they propose pursuing research on the role that individuals play in negotiations as well as interpersonal processes to fit this level into the negotiation literature and analysis. A negotiation concept from Bill's work that has been particularly relevant for me as I watch governments gather in Brazil for the 30th session of the Conference of the Parties to the Treaty on Climate Change, for my job with an environmental think tank, are his studies with Bert Spector, who is another one of his PhD students, on how international regimes function, evolve, and adjust over time through post-agreement negotiation processes. So a critical principle that underlines this work is that negotiation is a learning process. As Bert Spector wrote in a remembrance to Bill, learning underlies a lot of Zartman's research, and it places his research on a special platform, one that is dynamic and always at play. In this view, achieving outcomes in negotiation is possible only if the parties come to think about the problem, the strategies, the context, and the way out differently than they did before the negotiation began. And so in Brazil, how will learning from the past COP processes influence the talks this year? Will this year's talks be affected by changes in the power alignment, given that the US is choosing not to send a delegation, and China has announced its first ever commitment to an annual percentage reduction after its emissions peak? How will the Brazilian presidency, which is has a very competent diplomatic corps, manage the negotiation process? And perhaps most importantly, are these negotiations 30 years in and now focused on implementing an agreement different from the negotiations that established the agreement? And this is a question that Bill and Sunisa also raised in the Rethinking Negotiation book. So Bill's work in mentorship has inspired my path to learn and be curious about what is possible through negotiations. And for that, I joined Dan and others in this room in acknowledging the incredible legacy and the shoulders he gave us to stand on.
Well, it's a real pleasure and privilege to be here with so many of Bill's very accomplished friends, associates, and his many, many students. And I think it's fair to say, even though some of us didn't write our dissertations under him, we were all students of Bill. We learned from him. He criticized our work, always in a constructive way, and was in many ways the ideal colleague and mentor. I thought I would highlight three aspects of Bill's work that certainly had an impact on my own thinking. Pamela warned us not to talk about ripeness, so I'm going to try to avoid talking about ripeness. I'll leave that to Sunisa. And some of this was touched on by Chet in his very eloquent remarks. Bill had a lot to say about the role of power in international politics, but he wasn't your traditional realist, because a lot of his work and thinking was really directed at how smaller and weaker parties, often states, can get their way with more powerful actors in the international system. And in Bill's world, power defined by military might, economic resources, geography, and population side weren't necessarily winning formula or capacities at the bargaining table. And he argued and showed both theoretically but also empirically that weaker parties can often tip the table in their favor. And they do that by building coalitions, reframing issues, but also, as he, I think very rightly pointed out, through commitment tactics. His theory of commitment in some ways was not very different from Thomas Schelling and his strategy of conflict, where Schelling emphasizes that commitment is both a tactical and strategic instrument in negotiation, and that the act of deliberately constraining one's own freedom is a way to enhance credibility and influence the other party's choices. So like Schelling, Zartman saw credible self-binding commitments that can be expressed through public declarations, various kinds of institutional constraints, or pointing to sunk costs as a way to extend or change the bargaining range. But whereas Schelling sort of limited his analysis, and I don't mean this to sound critical, but Schelling expressed it very much in formal game theoretic terms, Zartman's innovation was to take it to the world of real diplomacy and conflict resolution. And he made the very important point, and this was, I think, his important qualification of the commitment, tactics, strategy argument, is that effective negotiators always balance credible commitment with flexibility in order to avoid deadlock at the bargaining table. If you overcommit yourself, you will delay ripeness. Positions will harden. So you have to calibrate your commitments in a way that you clarify interests, you establish trusts, and you thereby create the conditions for effective negotiation. And I think that's a very important insight. And it's one that one sees used very effectively by countries that are in the position of negotiating with big, powerful neighbors in some cases. And it's highly relevant to the situation Canada finds itself right now dealing with Donald Trump. But I'm not going to bore you with that because we could be here all night. Bill also made hugely important contribution to our understanding, and Lynn talked about this, of multilateral negotiation processes, which really were the menu of choice in terms of how the international system operated after the end of the Cold War, and some would argue in the creation of international institutions and regimes after the Second World War. And his core insight there was, when you have lots of parties, lots of issues to deal with, and basically it's a mess, the way you bring order to that is through a process of coalition formation. Now, again, there are others who've written about this very persuasively. Jim Sebenius at Harvard, some of you obviously know his work. He used a combination of game theory, decision analysis to show how that complexity is organized. But, to come back to something Chet said, Bill explained it in terms of a metaphor, and his metaphor was one of a bus. And in a bus, you have a driver, you have a conductor, you have passengers, and passengers sit in different seats in the bus, and some have their preferred seats in the bus. And he extended the metaphor. This is where it perhaps breaks down, but he also said they're breakers as well, people who slow the bus down. And really what he was saying is that, for an effective international negotiation, you do need role-playing. You need the parties to play different roles. And when the parties understand their roles and some are just passengers, the system can actually work. And there may well be a flexible geometry there, variable geometry, in the sense that coalitions aren't necessarily fixed. They often change, and they're often very issue specific. But he brought the very important idea of agency into our understanding of negotiation processes. He pointed out that chairs can play a really important role. And if you have an incompetent chair, you're not going to get very far. If you have a good chair, a chair can do a whole lot, not just through effective coalition management, but obviously the sequencing of issues, the trading of issues off against each other, and so forth. And I think that insight really, certainly for students, brings that whole process alive in terms of how you manage complexity. Final comment, Bill's contributions to conflict management. To my mind, Bill's greatest contribution there was his, shall we say, cardinal insight into the sources of protracted conflicts, which he described, I think quite rightly, as wars of need, greed, and creed. With the outbreak of civil wars in the 90s, there was literally tomes of scholarship that said, well, these are identity conflicts. Others who said, these are post-colonial conflicts. But Bill, I think, had a very synthetic view, which brought in the political economy dimension that sustains these conflicts, the fact that ideology, religion, what he called creed, are drivers of these conflicts, but that these are also conflicts of need, of socioeconomic differentiation. And I think that typology was certainly used by many, but it also, and I couldn't resist saying this, it also, Bill was smart enough to know that lots of conflicts never ripen, right? And he called those supportive, mutual, soft, and stable. And the reason they're stable and there's a sustainable conflict equilibrium is because of the interplay between need, creed, and greed. And greed is often a big part of it. Greed in terms of power, greed in terms of self-aggrandizement by warlords. And in that sense, Bill, as the realist, realized that not everything's going to ripen. And like Chet found out, sometimes you can't ripen it, even after many flights to the conflict zone. And in those circumstances, you just have to kind of walk away, or perhaps look at some levers to at least try to squeeze the conflict in terms of its political economy. Thank you.
Should be on.
All right. So I think for the sake of timekeeping and efficiency, I'll try to keep it focused and not go on tangents on the immense, monumental legacy that Bill has had on me personally and on this field generally. But given the opportunity, I would like to build on what we've just heard and say a few things about his legacy in conflict management in relation to two, I think, particularly consequential domains that he shaped. One is, needless to say, the ripeness theory, and I'll say a few words about that. But the second one is on mediation, which was mentioned by Chet, and I think it deserves to be a little bit more expanded even further to explain how much he shaped, changed, and pushed forward the way we think about mediation. When it comes to, so I'll start with mediation. So mediation was in the way he joined the conversation about third-party involvement. He defined it as a power play. So from that lens, he was this soft realist that Fenn is talking about. This comes from Fenn's lesser known, but I think one of the most profound articles published in 1997. He defines him as a soft realist. And I thought that was very thought-provoking, because even though, yes, he talks about mediation as a power play, there is more to mediation than just the exercise of power. And this is the way Bill is approaching it. So he talks about mediators as ripeners, those ones that actually are tasked with ripening the conflict. So you can do it by the virtue of exercising material power, providing tangible resources, but there is more to it, the way the conditions are ripened. So if we look at this intersection that he developed between ripeness theory and mediation, we see a lot of insights that he was more than just a soft realist. And I don't think he would admit that, even if he was on stage with us today, and if we confronted him saying, there's more to your theory than just soft realism, there will be some pushback. But let me try this now with the audience. One thing that he liked to say is that mediators are communicators and facilitators. They facilitate communication. And the reason why they ripen through facilitation is by changing the perceptions of the party. So he's already talking about perceptions. This is not just a material display of power. This is the change of the hearts and minds. And this is the first and most consequential part about mediation that he was talking about, is that this facilitation facilitates a better information flow between the parties. The second one is the formulator, the one that actually helps navigate the intricacies of the political moment, where even though the parties may see the light at the end of the tunnel, they need some degree of political support for the agreement to be accepted. So they give the mediators, they're there to provide this political cover for the conflicting parties. So that's also a perceptive thing. And a third one is what he would call as, he actually then broke it down later on into 3 subsegments: directive, coercive, manipulative. But it all boils down to this manipulative mode, the one that is most assertive, most active, most proactive, the one that provides these carrots and sticks, still with the goal of changing the hearts and minds of the parties. And he was cautioning against overly forceful mediation all the time, because he said this was not internalized by the parties, so the change may not be durable. So you can already see that everything I've said so far really does not advocate a very realist way of thinking about international politics, even though he knew that at the end of the day, this was a power play by the mediators. And this brings me down also to the way his most, I think, well-known theory, most read theory, is most misunderstood theory, and that's the theory of ripeness. Usually the way it's oversighted is by equating a ripe moment, and then people don't even say for what. Is it a ripe moment for negotiations, or is it a ripe moment for resolution? Even though the book cover that you see on the screen says ripe for resolution, what he was saying in his original mind, in his original framework, was ripe for negotiation. That was the original theory from the 80s. Later on, it expanded and explained how to ripe for resolution. It's a perceptive thing. So a realist would rarely talk about perception so much if you think about it, but the entire ripeness theory was based on perceptions of the parties. So yes, it was power play, was exercising leverage, but it was to the extent in which the parties will change the perceptions about the status quo. the perceptions about the utility of a negotiated outcome rather than a victory on the battlefield. So if we think about ripeness theory as I think a little bit more a sophisticated form of bridging constructivism with realism, that really is what Bill was talking about. He was talking about the value of norms. He was talking about structures, about regime building, especially through multilateral negotiations. That is the secret sauce. He could bring in, even without saying it explicitly, all of the insights from other domains of international relations theories into a very complex framework for conflict management that was applied. So I take the liberty, whenever I teach classes in conflict management, to say that the best way to understand international relations is through conflict management. Because all of the layers of international relations are actually at the best way of interplay that can be observed is through international conflict management practice. So that I hope can also help us understand how we can move forward his legacy. And yes, the book that we worked on over the past few years, that was published 2 years ago, really was trying to kind of make an effort to clarify some of the misconceptions about his own work, ripeness in particular. So Bill liked to work with concepts usually in triplets. So it was need, create, and greed, facilitation, formulation, manipulation. So there was always three. So ripeness originally had two. It had mutually hurting stalemate, way out, both perceptive, right? But he always was talking about a third element without really expressing it out loud, which was the perception of a mutually enticing opportunity. And in the book that we worked together on, I was adamant that he would allow for the third element to be brought in so that it will no longer be ripeness for negotiations, but this time we can talk, with the introduction of the third concept, ripeness for resolution. Because then we really realize why negotiations succeed, why negotiated agreements are sought through, why negotiated agreements live for an extended period of time. It's because this MEO that he was always talking about, but he was never recognized for it. That's the misunderstanding of ripeness theory from the beginning, that everyone reduced it to the perception of a mutually hurting stalemate. But he was always clear to say, it's a necessary but insufficient condition. And he was very adamant at saying this. And I think as we continue working and building on his legacy is to be true to his words, because there's so much to it to build on, rather than oversimplifying, which I see that when people try to reference a lot of his work to reduce it to simple chunks, it was an extraordinarily complex mind and an extraordinarily substantive contribution. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I'm not sure what happens next. Is it a coffee break?
We have a short break.
We have a short break. So please join us someplace for a short break. Yes,
Thank you all.
There.
Good to see so many smiling faces here in honor of Professor Zartman. My name is Learned Dees. I am a graduate of SAIS, 1985, but I didn't know Professor Zartman as a professor. He was on sabbatical when I was here. I heard two things about him while I was a student. One is that he was a great listener, and the other that he was a great convener. So in his honor today, we're convened a panel of African specialists to talk about an area that he loved deeply. A little bit about myself, and then I'll introduce the panelists and we'll get started. Like I said, my name is Learned Dees. I am a recently retired Foreign Service officer, spent 20 years working at the Department of State, focused on Africa mainly. And I'm currently an adjunct professor here at Johns Hopkins, and I'm the focus area lead for Africa. To my right, I have Peter Lewis, who's introduced himself this morning. He's the Vice Dean for faculty and the former head of African Studies before he got his esteemed promotion. His specialty is conflict in Nigeria and West Africa. And so I will keep the introduction short. All protocols observed. For those who know African affairs, you know what that means. Terry Lyons is a professor at George Mason. It's called the Carter School.
We are the Carter School.
The Carter School, appropriately named, a specialist on the Horn of Africa, another one of Africa's great conflict zones. And to his left, we have Rick Ehrenreich, who is a specialist in Central Africa, the Great Lakes to be specific. He worked at the State Department for many, many years, and for those of us who worked at the State Department, we remember you, Rick, as the expert on all things Africa. So with that brief introduction, let's get started with Peter Lewis.
Thanks, Learned. Apologies for the mantle, but this is how it worked out. I was delighted to note that I could get to the coffee break without supplementary oxygen. So it was really kind of like going up Kilimanjaro or something. You know, you sort of just take it one step at a time. As we've been discussing, Bill Zartman was a formidable scholar with, I've tried to count and can't accurately, but at least 50 titles that I can track that he authored, edited, or on which he collaborated. And he began his academic inquiry with a focus on both international relations and African politics. And he's had major influence in the evolving domain of area studies, which really has been a particular and distinctive strength of U.S. academia, really for more than 60 years. Area studies and regional studies, of which SAIS is a proud bastion, not a last bastion, but a proud representative, it really is a unique, I think, characteristic of the contributions that U.S. academia, it's not exclusively the U.S., but it certainly was a noteworthy trend in U.S. academia beginning in the late 50s and carrying forward. And Bill was very much a part of that in the Africa field. His engagement with African studies was, I think, marked by several distinctions, however. First, he was able to pivot between comparative politics and international relations. He certainly gave extensive treatment to domestic politics in numerous states across the region, but also treated foreign policies and regional relationships and broader global relationships of the region and the rest of the world. Indeed, when I was an undergraduate, which I referenced earlier, international relations in the New Africa was a standout volume, and really one of the lone scholarly works on emerging international relations on the continent. In an era when in the 60s and the 70s, people were writing monographs on domestic politics in countries all over the continent, very little work being done on foreign policy or the structure of international relations on the continent. His work on conflict and state fragility and negotiations and borders, all of which have been referenced earlier, drew heavily on African experience and African cases and helped to shape those fields. And indeed, some people may be familiar with a book that came out really at the turn of this century. Bob Bates and Paul Collier and others worked on that, called Africa and the Disciplines. And they looked at how the study of Africa had contributed to a variety of disciplinary, a range of disciplinary knowledge. And indeed, there, as has been referenced, Professor Zartman regularly drew on African cases and African examples and points of reference as a way of elaborating broader themes, and in turn made important contributions to the fields of conflict resolution and conflict management, negotiation, and so forth, really using African cases as an important taproot, if you will. The second thing that's worth noting is the exceptional regional scope of Bill's work. He was a Francophone and Anglophone scholar. He could work with Arabic. He had particular familiarity with the Maghreb and the Maghrebi states, and really very few of our colleagues in African regional studies can work across multiple language areas, and fewer still can traverse the northern states and sub-Saharan Africa and really take essentially a Cape to Cairo view, if you will. Bill's wide scope and his comparative insights were distinctive, which was evident not only in his writing, but also in the remarks at nearly every panel he joined. And I've seen many of them over the years, and his facility to just come up with references to, a dozen different cases or evoke a vignette around a particular problem or a particular moment or incident are really, truly striking. And he was constantly summoning up and commenting on cases of which he had an encyclopedic and really fluent knowledge. Third, as Director of African Studies at SAIS, Bill Zartman charted a course in regional studies. For well over a decade, the program sponsored a Country Day conference each year that yielded a book, first published by Prager and then later handed off to Lynn Reiner Publishers, among the most prominent academic trade presses. And the program produced volumes on Morocco, Tunisia, South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon, Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, and Botswana, along with several thematic volumes on conflict management, collapsed states, boundaries, and other issues. And these books still stand today as part of our contemporary library of African studies. If we look at the lineage of the literature and what the significant works are, they're still used and cited today, particularly the book on collapsed states, but many of the country volumes are also very significant. And finally, Zartman made important conceptual contributions for the study of Africa. As has been mentioned in the previous panel, ripeness in conflict and conflict dynamics, the processes and aspects of state collapse, ideas about opportunity and risk in negotiations, the formation and influences of borders, the debate over greed and grievance, whether economic agendas or social and political drivers are essential to conflict. All of those were thoughtful, important, and really significant statements that helped shape our conversations and our understanding over the years. So as much as anybody, Bill Zartman has influenced our understanding of conflict and security, especially across the African continent. And so we can focus our appreciation on Bill Zartman's encompassing regional scholarship and his role in advancing our field in important ways. And the fact that many of these contributions came during a long career of 4 decades at SAIS is also a special point of distinction of which we can be, I think, justifiably proud. Thanks.
Thank you, and it's a great pleasure to follow you. You've taken about half of my points, so I'll be able to be a bit briefer, I hope. You mentioned the Country Day, and it just struck me looking at this beautiful room. Remember being in the 1740 Mass Avenue room and looking at all the flags. There were always, just below the ceiling, there was this arrangement of flags, and I spent many a day in that room, particularly the Africa Country Days. We've moved into a different space, than a lovely space at that. I'm going to try, not necessarily try to be provocative, but to try to be clear in how I position myself with regard to Zartman, who, well, you'll see where I'm going with this. Because I really want to give kind of a full-throated articulation of Zartman as an Africanist. And so following the conflict management folks who clearly have their own engagement with the scholarship that, you know, when I said I was a Zartman student, people said, oh, so you're a conflict management student. I said, no, no, no. I'm an Africa Studies student, and always was, and that was always part of who he was. I came to SAIS in 1985, and the way I like to think about it is that when I read, you know, International Relations of the New Africa and a Man-State Society in the Contemporary Maghreb before I read The Practical Negotiator, right? That was the stuff I was reading. I read Ripe for Resolution as a book on African politics. All the case studies in that book are Africa, and it was a way of understanding Africa through the negotiations and the ripe moment and the incredible theoretical advances, but it was simultaneously a book in the Africanist, African studies, area studies, although that's anyways, the Africanist studies. And what I think with Zartman is it wasn't so much that, I still haven't quite come up with the vocabulary here, but it wasn't just, it's not correct to say that he was straddling fields, but that he was firmly embedded in multiple fields and could use that vision that he had to draw from one to explain the other. And so one way you see that is he constantly wrote books about Africa. He called them things like Cowardly Lions or Collapsed States or Elusive Peace, but you look at the subtitles and it's almost always Africa. It's always governance as conflict management, I guess he called it. The subtitle was Politics and Violence in West Africa. You know, that was how he thought about these things. He constructed these things through the Africanist lens. But at the same time, he applied, who was it? You made that, you know, international negotiations was the best way to understand international relations. I think it's also the case that negotiations, in Zartman's view, was the best way to understand governance. And some of his best work was on, in my view, the links between governance and conflict management and negotiations and governance. And through that, thinking about norms. He always wanted to think about norms. He always wanted to think about institutions. He always wanted to say, you can't ignore the state. That's the context in which some of these most difficult of conflicts are done. Let me shift slightly to drill down for a minute in the work that I was probably. Let me put it this way. When I heard the news that Professor Zartman, after this long and illustrious career, had passed away, and began thinking about the influence he had on my own work, my own way of understanding the world, I spent a lot of time thinking of a book, Sovereignty as Responsibility, that he wrote along with Francis Deng and the much-missed Donald Rothschild and myself. I was at Brookings at that time. And to think about that as not the origin of the idea of responsibility to protect, which it both was but isn't, because that book was much more about governance than about humanitarian intervention. It was not about the outside military coming in and saving states. It was understanding how negotiation processes need to be in the very fiber of how states respond to what he called in that West Africa book that I referenced earlier, these demand making groups. And so that was in my mind, and then I read the book that he co-wrote with you, Sensei, on rethinking conflict resolution and management, and it gets repeated in that as he's rethinking, along with you, as he's rethinking these concepts, that it's not about how, you know, the United States or the UN or the EU is going to go in and organize the world. It's a much different take than you might get from the responsibility to protect literature, which really came out of Yugoslavia, where the sovereignty as responsibility really came out of an understanding of Africa. And that's what I mean by understanding what was on his mind when he was developing these ideas, to me, is essential to understanding the vast array of literature, including the negotiations literature. And so, sparked by the book on rethinking conflict resolution and management, trying to see how Zartman might want to think about, you know, because there has this notion in that book about we're in a new world disorder, that this is, and therefore the old methods of managing conflict maybe are not resonating in the same way. But if you go back to some of the ideas that I see as coming out of sovereignty as responsibility, then you begin to say, oh, it's about governance, it's about institutions, it's about norms, and there are things that we can go back to that, mid-1985 was it? Anyways, no, whenever it was, 95 I guess it was, after the Cold War, you begin to, these things blend together. But you can go back to those times as different as they were, but to realize, no, it remains to be a challenge, as I think Professor Zartman laid out, of institutions and norms and governance and inclusion, and that those are the concepts that continue to be the way out of this current world disorder. Thank you.
Yeah, I think Bill Zartman, a lot of us know him best through his conflict work, but he started out academically as a regionalist, and a very good one. And his first love was Morocco. His first area of deep academic interest was Morocco, and he steadily expanded. He expanded to the rest of the Maghreb, the rest of Africa, the rest of West Africa, the rest of Africa, and then to conflicts around Africa and the world, and really got into conflict studies from there. A personal note on Morocco, that's where I first engaged with him, or not engaged with him on Morocco as opposed to in Morocco. I was a researcher and writer at American University at the time, a part of American University known as Foreign Area Studies. That wrote the area handbooks, country studies, and I was a sub-Saharan kind of guy, and our group was assigned to work on Morocco, and then followed by Algeria and Tunisia, and I was thinking, oh my God, I don't know anything about these places. So of course I went to Bill Zartman, who I hadn't met before, but I'd read some of his papers and articles. The political elites in North Africa from '82, and the one the next year from explaining the nearly inexplicable the absence of Islam in Moroccan foreign policy. And I thought, these are kind of interesting works. And I knew the guy was good, and what I found in interviewing him was, he was very knowledgeable about the region, very insightful, and very approachable. The experience of dealing with him, first on Morocco and then followed up with some of the other Maghreb countries, it was easy to bond with the guy, and that inspired me to pursue a PhD study at SAIS on Africa and conflict resolution. So I got the best of both worlds from him. On Morocco, Morocco was probably as a country analyst, that was where Zartman started, and I think that was where he went deepest compared to any other country. Others might disagree, but he had this way of looking at this was during the time his 60s work. Did a really good job of sort of looking at the national power and interest, the leadership decision-making, the norms and the various forces, domestic and foreign, that affected the leadership's perceptions and actions. And he just sort of, his theme then and later on as a theoretician was really on leadership decision-making. Why did they make the decisions that they did? And he had this way of, again, a focus on the leaders, but then an appreciation for all the pressures on them, the societal pressures, the political pressures, the national norms that tended to influence the decision-making, influence the outcomes. And again, this was during the days of King Mohammed V and the early days of Hassan II, and he wrote some really good work that is relevant to this day. I mean, and I think a lot of his work was focused on issues in general that would be of interest to quote-unquote realists, to practitioners, to diplomats, to military folks. And he was essentially giving lessons to us to sort of say, this is what you got to look at, this is what you have to pay attention to, this is how these guys think. And they were always very, very practical. His book, Chet Crocker mentioned it, Problems of New Power. That was an excellent book. And years later, 20 years later, when I was working on this other Morocco book, it was like, yeah, this is a useful book. And it had this way of, again, in a very Zartman-like way, you look at the country, you look at the leadership, and he breaks down decision-making in terms of how do they look at this issue? How do they look at agrarian reform? How do they look at military reform? How do they look at the question of removing U.S. bases from Morocco? How do they look at encouraging the Arabization of education? How did they hold elections without risking their own power? And it was the way he sort of phrased it together, you could get a really good sense of the country, but also of specifically of how leaders made decisions. And I think this notion of the pressures on leadership is something that starts with his regional work, with his country work, but sort of extends throughout his career. Why do people negotiate? How do they negotiate? What are the pressures that they're under? And I think he was impressive from that point of view. From Morocco, he wrote more on the again expanding into the rest of the Maghreb, comparing the countries of the Maghreb, writing again new treatments and making connections that people hadn't made before. Others had mentioned his book on the international relations in the new Africa. Well, it's not all about Africa. It's basically about the Maghreb and the former British and French colonies in West Africa. But in looking at these areas, he was able to make really broad generalizations that did count for, that did have a resonance in much of the rest of Africa. A lot of it was on, where did the OAU come from? What were the negotiations there? And it was an excellent book. And then as his reputation grew and people wanted to work with him, that's when the edited volumes started coming out. And that is, I tried to look at how many, what Zartman had written, and I'd look at one bibliography and sort of thought this was pretty good, and then I'd look at another bibliography and it had stuff that wasn't in the first one and omitted stuff that the first one had. So this role going on behind us is probably as good a bibliography as we're likely to get. I guess one of the things I do want to sort of follow up on what Terry was saying about the Country Day series, those were great. And when I was having that conversation with Bill about Morocco, he was working on organizing the conference for the Morocco Day. And I was blown away. He had like 10 really sharp experts working on 10 different chapters that a year and a half or whatever later came out in a really good volume on Morocco. Something that it's probably getting a little dated now, but boy, it was a good one at the time, and there's a lot there that still resonates. And I think one of his criticisms, a couple of his early volumes had been criticized by saying, hey, you don't have enough people from the local country or the local region writing on this. But certainly by the time I encountered him, the Morocco book, for instance, is like, there are a number of people from the Maghreb that contributed chapters, and they, rather than touching specifically on leadership decision making, the book went broader than most of Zartman's personal work. They talk about religion and politics, socio-political relations, agriculture, the family and the state, all these things that normally Zartman himself wouldn't pay that much attention to, but in these volumes he could do it. And I think one thing when you look at Zartman, and I think almost everybody that's spoken today has mentioned it. I mean, he basically had an inductive approach. His way of approaching problems and approaching theory was to look at the situation first, to try to understand things from the facts on the ground. He was not somebody who sort of invented a theory out of whole cloth and just sort of applied it to situations. And part of it was he came of age in the 60s, and this post-World War II period was just amazing because you had the combination of this bipolar world of the Cold War, which was unusual in recent history. You had the rapid retreat of colonialism, and you had the rise of what we then knew as the Third World. And all of this stuff there weren't strong theories for this. And for the theorist at the time, it would have been a really interesting time just to sort of look at the world and try to explain it and try to create theories. And Zartman was excellent at that. But again, all of his work was based on examining the case study first. As Terry noted, Right for Resolution, which is an excellent theoretical book, it's path-breaking theoretical book. Its case studies are really good area studies. It's well researched. I use them when the book first came out. I used it as a guide to sort of as a primer on various parts of various conflicts and various issues in Africa. And I guess I'll sort of wrap things up right now by sort of massacring John Maynard Keynes. And these days when you look around, there's a lot of people. There's a whole generation of people, or multiple generations of people, practitioners who've learned from Zartman, who've internalized the notion of ripeness. Or the mutually hurting stalemate, and okay, maybe they get it wrong here and there, but the mentality, the language is there, and it sort of reminds me of the Keynes comment that in the future, practical diplomats, many decades now, are likely to be slaves to the thinking of some long dead political scientist, and that political scientist's name was Ira William Zartman.
Thank you, Rick. I was thinking about the things that tie us all together here on the stage. We've all worked together professionally in some of the most difficult places in the world. You in the Great Lakes, you in the Horn of Africa, mine a little bit of both, and you in Nigeria. Professor Zartman worked on these issues his whole career, but if you met him, he was never pessimistic. He was always optimistic. There was always something you could do, a question that could be asked, a theory that could be developed. And I know we've been talking about what his label should be. Is it a soft realist? I was just thinking among us that he was really an informed optimist. And his whole career helped us become informed optimists, because you can't work on Africa like we have for 40 years and not be an informed optimist. So that's the legacy of Professor Zartman. Thank you.
One might say the opposite. One cannot work on Africa for 40 years and not be a pessimist.
My name is Daniel Serwer. I may be the odd one out in this room. I never took a course with Professor Zartman. None of my degrees are with Professor Zartman. I think I never contributed to a book of Professor Zartman's, which makes me pretty much the odd man out in this room. But he and I had a pretty intense relationship at times, the kind of relationship you have with somebody whose office is right next door, and you talk about everything every day. And I published a book in 2019 about the Balkans, Ukraine, and Middle East. I'm revising it now, and thinking very hard about issues of mutually hurting stalemate, mutually enticing outcome, because those issues are very apparent in these three parts of the world considered separate by most Americans, but in fact contiguous parts of the world that share a history in the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire and the Iranian Empire. With that, let me turn to our panel, who are all, I think, master's students. One of them is unavailable today due to illness. But Cecily, you're now listed as a non-resident scholar at Carnegie Endowment. Tell us what you're really doing and how it's informed by Professor Zartman's teaching.
Sure, happy to. Thank you. I first want to start by thanking particular Professor Sanusi and Isabel, who I know pulled this all together today. If you were a student in the conflict management program, you know that Isabel was the heart and soul of how things actually came to happen. You know, Professor Zartman had the ideas, and then Isabel had the Rolodex and the budget, and really that was, you were a team. And I see the conflict management program as the two of them working together all the time. So thank you. Clearly, the conflict management program, and particularly Professor Zartman, influenced the path of my whole career very tactically in that I went on, I think it was the second field trip of the program to Haiti. I'll talk more about that in a second. But one of the second-year students on that program went into the State Department in a new bureau that was called the Coordinator for Stabilization, Reconstruction and Stabilization, and I thought that sounded pretty cool. So I contacted him, and that led to 15 years in the State Department. And then Professor Zartman used to always talk about USIP, and I'd write down JUSSIP. What is he talking about? And then I left the State Department about a year ago and went to USIP, which he always called USIP. And so that was a dream of mine to go work there. And Pamela alluded briefly to the court case that's ongoing for fighting for the organization's future. But I just wanted to spend a few minutes saying, as a student of Professor Zartman, I think he had this unique talent, or maybe shared by a few special professors out there, to really kindle this inspiration in all of us. He didn't just teach us concepts, even though he did that. He didn't just teach us case studies and facts, although he did that. But in the way he described things, he just inspired me, and I think it's shared by many of those here, to just want to be part of the world and to kind of come to see it how he saw it and to understand it in the way he saw it. And so he translated those concepts to us through two things I'll talk about today. One are the field trips, and the other is the Peace Kids program. But students out there will remember the way his eyes would light up when he got excited about a concept he'd talk about. So he taught us about chicken and, driving straight towards each other and who's going to swerve first. He taught us about power dynamics, but not just by explaining, the asymmetry and how it matters more, but by teaching us the case study. I think it was Malta that had the military base that the UK wanted to extend the lease on, and how Malta, this tiny island nation, actually had far more power in the negotiation than the UK, but in a very illustrative way that I still remember to this day, that case study. I haven't looked back at it in many, many years. And then his Turkish rug seller, I've forgotten his name, some of you will remember this Turkish rug seller that he bargained with. So he didn't just teach us about bargaining, he told us about his personal experience in the souk, the poor rug seller. I'm sure got out-negotiated every time. But anyway, he really brought the concepts to life. And so he also did that through the field trips we went on, and they were such incredible training for all of us. Really, in a number of fields. I know I've talked to people who've gone into development. I went obviously into the State Department diplomacy side of things, but he taught us to always ask questions. And in fact, he sort of expected an insightful question to come from you. And so then you felt inspired to rise to this sort of quiet expectation that you could ask this great question. And then you'd watch as, you know, the conflict management cohort we'd do a series of interviews, and each person would start to sort of go deeper on an area of the conflict, and we'd each sort of become this group, and you knew that person was going to ask about that angle, and that person was going to ask about that angle. So you develop this by interviewing 30 or more, you know, high-level people, from presidents, and then we went to Haiti the first time, and we talked to spiritual leaders, and so he believed in understanding the whole kind of ecosystem of what was going on in a country, and encouraged us to see those each as equally valuable interviews. And it was up to us to parse all of this, sometimes conflicting information, and put it all together into this sort of cohesive picture. And then he expected us to write program papers about the field trip on an aspect of it. So then you had to pick it apart again and pick your aspect, and then he put it all together in a book. And that process, as I describe it, you probably understand, when you go in to do conflict analysis at the State Department and write cables and strategies, that ability to kind of have your preconceived notion, have it taken apart, put it back together again, work with other people, understand how they're thinking about it, such an invaluable way to sort of understand the field. And as I said, it was a very practical way to build networks, and he knew that his students would go on to kind of help each other as they got to know each other. So that was a really incredible experience. I'll leave you with one example from Haiti that he said he had, they had a really, this was from actually the first field trip, the field trip before me, but he wrote it in the beginning to our book that we put out, that they had gone on the field trip, and it had been totally sunny the whole trip. And then all of a sudden, the last day, there was this huge downpour of rain. And he said, oh, you know, I knew Haiti wasn't showing us its true self, or something like that. You know, this is the true Haiti, and it's kind of washing things away. But then I guess the sewers overflowed, and it was really dirty and had, you know, kind of overwhelmed the systems. And then he said he got up bright and early for church the next morning, and by then all the streets had been cleaned up and the trash organized for pickup. And so he said that's the true Haiti. It's the people trying to survive within a system, and he was always looking at the individual and the system they were in, and how he gave so much credit to the individuals who found ways to be entrepreneurial in a system that was always going to force them to be a certain way. And so I love that example of watching how his, you know, sort of expectations of what he's seeing changes over time. I also went to Cyprus, which was an incredible trip as well. And there he said, you know, we had a part of the book that was on the two sides of the problem and then the outsides of the problem. And that was him always kind of playing with words, but in a meaningful way, to give us a picture of what was going on. And then I'll just say a brief word about Peace Kids. It was a really incredible program, and it talks to how he really believed in not just teaching theory, but in teaching practice and in bringing theory into practice. And so this was a program by which a few of us got together and went into a local DC public school and taught the theories of conflict management to kids, middle school students who were going to use these in a very practical way every day, right in their daily lives. It wasn't about international relations. We talked about recognizing, so understanding and analyzing conflicts. We talked about respect, attitudes and awareness, and then resolve, skills and strategies. So of course, this work on the international level, but he really believed that that could make a difference in people's lives in this city. And that was a really great thing to be a part of. And I'll just say, he was also a terrific mentor. And when I wrote him to tell him I had given birth to a baby boy many years ago, he wrote back, "And congratulations on the son. Sons are good things. Why, they're just as good as daughters." And that was a very Zartman sort of like way of looking at the world. Always makes me laugh.
Thank you, Cecily. John?
Thank you. Very nice to be here. Quick personal story. I have two kids, teenage boys. They're wonderful. We also have a pet rabbit. His name is Yoda. For whatever reason, in our house, the most contentious thing imaginable is who has to feed Yoda dinner. Because you got to go downstairs into the basement. It's dark down there. You got to get out the lettuce and the hay and so forth. And we do this right before dinner, and everyone's always a little bit hungry, a little bit grumpy. And this weekend, my kids just had this blow up argument on who's going to feed Yoda. Everybody's grumpy. I don't want to do it. You did it yesterday. No, it's your turn, blah, blah, blah. And I'm thinking about, and all the weekend I was trying to think of, like, what am I going to say at this thing? And of course, I realized at that moment that we had a, say it with me, mutually hurting stalemate. Doesn't just apply in the big, conflict resolution world out there. And we, of course, needed our mutually enticing opportunity, which turned out to be whoever fed Yoda got to pick the movie that night. So I've learned lots of things from Dr. Zartman, the very smallest level and to the very largest levels as well. I came to SAIS in 2001 as a conflict management and African studies student, so right in the Dr. Z bullseye. I'll admit he was a little bit intimidating at first. This incredibly esteemed guy whose stuff I had read for so long. But that really didn't last too long because he was incredibly personable as well and easy to talk to and supportive. And I realized, particularly having been in his office and talked to him about various papers, that he really checked his ego at the door. And he was a teacher first and foremost, and he was there to educate his students. He was there to help you get smarter along your educational journey. He was not shy about telling you when he thought something was stupid, but he did it in a way that didn't make you feel that way, in a way that really helped you along that path and to figure out a better course intellectually. Let me just mention sort of three moments that stood out as I was sort of thinking through my time here and my time with Dr. Zartman. One is that this must have been probably 2002, 2003, he brought John Garang here. And this was, the height of the Sudanese Civil War. Garang was very much in the bush with the SPLA. But he was out for a while, he was making the rounds, and so, it was Dr. Garang and a bunch of very tall South Sudanese folks in very bright suits. But it was this incredible experience because, it was Dr. Zartman and a bunch of master's students like sitting around the table with this figure who was changing the world in a lot of ways, and I don't think you would have that kind of experience in many other places. Another one that sticks out was, and we've referenced this once or twice already today, he pulled together this conference on rethinking borders in Africa. And when you think about it, it's a pretty bold thing to do because at least on a very official level, we didn't talk about whether these borders made sense anymore. And South Sudan had to fight for many decades in order to redraw that border, and the AU said these borders are what they are. He was willing to challenge conventional wisdom that way, and not afraid to ask tough questions, and I think that really resonated with a lot of his students and showed a great model to them. Finally, a bit on the lighter side, I recall every spring, at least when I was around, he would have all of his students over to his house for a nice brunch. And there was a croquet set out in the yard. And inevitably a game would happen. And it turned out Dr. Zartman was very competitive in his croquet. And I do recall him not winning once or twice and sort of being over in the corner and kind of sulking a little bit about coming up short in his croquet game. So there was that aspect to him as well. But overall, an incredible mentor, an incredible teacher, and just very thankful to be able to share a few memories here today.
Thank you, John. Shauna?
Thank you. This is such an honor to be here today. All of these stories are making me laugh so much because they just help me remember, and all of us remember and celebrate what an incredible mentor and human Dr. Zartman was, and a professor, a mentor, and a cornerstone of my SAIS experience. And now coming back and teaching a class as an adjunct, it just really feels so full circle because he inspired that. And I hope that I can have a positive impact on students the way that he had on me and so many. So for me, as a conflict management concentration, can I see a raise of hands? How many of you work conflict management? This is incredible. I mean, these were my people. This was my community. We spent, and especially, was anyone in the global, the Security and Conflict Management Club, or the GSCM? Anyone? Hey, I love that. Okay, we just had countless hours, talking about and reflecting on these deep questions, right? These really big questions about humanity, about peace. And it was this sense of belonging, this intellectual curiosity that he inspired and cultivated. And it created a space where these ideas could really flourish and where we could challenge each other respectfully. One of the most formative experiences for me was the Colombia trip that we took. And I just love hearing about other people's experiences and their adventures. And it was very impactful because we went to Bogota, but we also went to Choco. And that was an opportunity to meet with more rural communities and to really understand how inequities in access to resources, inequities and disparities in terms of governance really contributed to perceptions of or grievances, and saw how that contributed to cycles of violence. And that really underscored for me the critical importance of including historically marginalized voices. And I've spent the last decade working on these issues, particularly in international development, but how important they are to look at some of these root causes and understand how communities and societies are relating to one another. And it was a lesson that really stayed with me and shaped my career path. Also gave me a lot of practical tips in interviewing, right? And really practically looking at strategies to engage with people and to connect. I've probably done over 100 gender and social inclusion assessments. These interviewing techniques and observing and participating and challenging yourself to go deeper was really a critical skill that I'll take with me. But it's really charted my path in global development, working in places like Libya and Syria and Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine. And really, it wasn't just teaching theory, it was inspiring a sense of purpose in the work that you're doing and connecting with others when you're engaging in those communities. And for that, I'm deeply grateful. I am just one person, right, that he's impacted. But I had to reach out to my other conflict management, GSCM, peers and hear their thoughts. I called my friend Irina, and she's in Geneva now. And I have to share some thoughts from them. Because they resonate with me as well. She remembers Dr. Z's wit and playfulness. He had a glint in his eye. How many of you see that glint in his eye? Everyone says, if you look in these pictures up here, you see, you're not sure, the joy in the curiosity that he has in life. And also it seems like something's always up his sleeve, like he's up to something, and you have to figure it out. It just inspires such a sense of happiness in what you're doing and curiosity. And I think that lent to his approachability. You never were really that afraid to ask a question and engage in a conversation. And I think it was very mutual. He gave back to you how much you gave to him. You could see that he enjoyed being in that room, in that classroom. And he taught us so much, but I could see he got so much from that. And that felt incredible. And so, she said that he was always ready to debate and listen. He never made students feel lesser. He believed in their ideas. He believed in their research. And he even recommended her thesis for publication in a prestigious journal, which launched her career. And she told me that if it wasn't for him, she believes that she wouldn't be where she is today. I also reached out. It was just great. I called everyone this weekend, and I reached out. I wanted to see how they're doing to Yael. And she told me that she came to SAIS expecting academic rigor, but found so much more. He welcomed students into his home, again, to play croquet, which is amazing, brought them to teach conflict management in DC schools with Peace Kids. And for her, Peace Kids was really transformative through those 3 R's that you had mentioned, recognize, respect, resolve. He said that peace building isn't abstract, right? It starts in the classroom. It starts at home. I use it with my kids every day as well. And where kids face real conflicts. He said that tomorrow's negotiators need both analytical skills and empathy. And Yael said that Dr. Z taught her peacemaking begins with recognizing the humanity in others, and that's a lesson that he embodied with everything that he did. So for me, he didn't just teach us conflict management. He modeled what it means to lead with curiosity, with humility, with humanity. And on behalf of all of us, I would love to say thank you to him for shaping not only our education, but our lives.
Thank you, Shauna. I'll add just a couple of words. I went on 2 trips with Bill, one to Israel and Palestine and one to Doha and Riyadh during the break between the two capitals. And one of the things that I remember most vividly is how comfortable he was in such incredibly different situations, whether they were physical situations. In East Jerusalem, we were staying in a pretty ratty hotel. He didn't mind that, but you see a picture of him up there sitting on one of the royal aircraft in Saudi Arabia when the Saudis decided that what we really needed to do was visit Al Ula, which is now a big tourist attraction in Saudi Arabia. He was just as comfortable in the royal aircraft as he was in the ratty hotel in East Jerusalem. He was comfortable with everybody's ideas. We had at least one student in the Israel-Palestine thing that had some ideas, so it seemed very near the envelope to us. And we talked with him a great deal. Bill always listened, but he also criticized. And that paper probably comes closer to predicting what actually happened than most of the other papers, because it ended in violence, and that one student was thinking that that's what would happen. So he was comfortable with everybody. And on the croquet field, I agree with you, he was very competitive in croquet. Comfortable at brunch, comfortable in social situations, comfortable with a lot of different ideas coming from many different directions. And for that, I'm grateful to him. Thank you all.
So good afternoon, everyone. This is the final panel of the afternoon, I believe, and our theme here is From Theory to Practice. I am Terry Hauptman. I had the privilege of serving as director of the conflict management program when Bill Zartman stepped down as director for 10 years afterwards, but also having worked with Bill for many years before that. I first met Bill at a conference in Minnesota in 1975, 50 years ago, I believe exactly, which I think was actually organized by the Harvard negotiation program, which is sometimes viewed as a friendly competitor in terms of theories about international negotiations. And we stayed in contact thereafter. But really, teaching negotiations for many years at the University of Minnesota and later at Brown, particularly important in terms of the theme of this topic was when this book came out, The Practical Negotiator. I have brought my copy here, which is falling apart. The cover is completely fallen off. And indeed, I used it as a textbook in courses in negotiation at Minnesota and at Brown University for at least a decade and a half, and I must have sold several thousand copies for Bill as a sort of central book in that course for many, many years. And indeed, the theme that came out at that time was moving from some of the very abstract theories of negotiation, which had been very influential, particularly from some of our colleagues at Harvard, like Tom Schelling, who was mentioned before, Howard Rafa also at the Harvard Business School, and Anatole Rappaport, University of Michigan, and later Toronto, who developed theories of negotiation based upon the rational actor model, based upon theories of games and so forth and so on, much of which is, of course, very foundational in some ways for theories of international negotiation. But it was Bill, and in part this book, which more than anything else, I think, led to the transition in our field from thinking about negotiations primarily in terms of these sort of formal theoretical models to also thinking about moving from theory to practice. How do we translate these kinds of theories into the practical application and work of international negotiations? And so that is the theme of this panel. And I would first like to recognize Tova Norland, who is, we all, of course, are all, they are all, of course, former students of Bill and of this program at SAIS.
Thank you, Terry. Sorry, I've lost my voice. I chaperoned a birthday party with 7 12-year-old boys who all slept over, so. So I'm going to try. I wrote this out in case, Isabel, you were going to have to read it for me. So I wanted to reflect on 3 things, or 2 things that are sort of the serious part of this. And the first one is very much in line with what you just said, Terry, regarding this transformation of the scholarship from, the negotiation to really an academic or like an analytical structure that can be applied all over IR. And various panelists have talked about leverage and power. So really it's manipulation of leverage and power that is really useful for me to understand where I am at the moment in the Department of Defense or Department of War, or maybe more appropriately labeled the Department of Strength, Peace Through Strength in this crowd at the moment. Although right now I'm furloughed, of course. And then I also wanted to ask us in the room, what would Zartman do? WWZD. So first of all, though, I do need to reflect on some personal anecdotes, because this man, and if I can get through the personal, is larger than life for me. He has been in my life constantly for 26 years since I came to SAIS, and it's hard for me to even see this room and feel like, there's something huge missing. Anyways, if I talk more about that, I'll probably start crying. So I came to SAIS having done my undergrad at University of Uppsala in Sweden, where his name was larger than life. He was so revered that most of the students who were doing their BA and MA thesis wrote their thesis about his ripe moment theory. That was the big book. I even put his name in my title of my BA thesis. I probably wouldn't have done that if I knew that he was an actual real human that I might meet. But anyways, it caught his eye, he liked it, and sure enough, I came to SAIS as a PhD student. I was accepted. To me, it was like winning the lottery. It was really not something that I ever imagined. He changed, obviously, then my life. I wouldn't be here today. I wouldn't even be an American citizen today working for the DoD if it weren't for him really putting his faith in me and a lot of other, I would say, international PhD students who came to SAIS through him. For us, I think especially, it was the full package. We became part of his life. He shared his family. He shared his generosity with us. And for me, it continued for 26 years until just 2 weeks before his passing. I spent 2 Sundays with him, and then I went on vacation to Sweden when he passed away. So his, as I said, impact was far more than academic. And there was so much friendship, and he was like a father figure to me, sharing, actually, even towards the end, a friendship with my father, my real father. And they shared interests of historic houses and grandkids and children and their pride. So when I first arrived, I heard someone talk about intimidation. I was very intimidated. And one Friday afternoon, Teresa asked if she could give Zartman my phone number. I was so scared. That Friday night, he called me, and I thought I'd done something wrong. But no, instead, he invited me to go ice skating with a family the next day. And from that moment, we've shared, me and my husband, and now my kids also have shared in so many family events with them, Alex and Sue's wedding, Christmases, Thanksgivings, ballet performances, and so on. My husband actually did beat Zartman in croquet. And I was a little nervous then. So anyway, so his engagement and his energy was contagious. We've talked about him being a painter, a singer, a dancer, car mechanic, house restorer, while also being a prolific scholar. Once when I met him for coffee, he had to dash off to go to a tap dancing class. And this was like 6 years ago. So as others have said also, he injected joy in every conversation, always had a twinkle in his eye. But he had little patience for stupidity or arrogance, and he really supported his PhD mentees in thick and thin. One time in Austria, he, and you might remember this, took a bunch of books and threw them in front of a certain Russian colleague's desk or on the conference table, because he was actually he was criticizing my pick of PhD thesis topic. And then he went to Mass across the street. So the transformation of the scholarship I wanted to talk about from where I'm sitting in DOD. One of the things, I think about his theories and what I've learned almost every day. And I see how he kind of filled the space between negotiation being just dispute resolution from the Harvard Project to also analyzing and understanding the power dynamics of diplomacy and international relations on the other hand. So traditionally it was sort of negotiation was what you did at a table. It was a singular event or a series of encounters, and it involved tricks, strategies, and basically to secure the better outcome for the adversaries, whether it's distributive or integrative. But his work challenged us and helped us expand those boundaries, and he pushed us to look beyond the negotiation table and consider the broader context of power, leverage, incentives, norms, and so on. And the operationalization of right moment theory incorporated elements that political scientists and especially also military historians would recognize as the various sources of power of states. So by applying negotiation bargaining perspective to large-scale international events, he demonstrated the power could be shaped and manipulated through the right structures, mechanisms, processes, and strategies. And from where I'm sitting today in the sort of more practitioner, the security and defense side, unfortunately, there's very little understanding of this expanded notion of negotiation analysis. And in fact, over the past 4 years, or at least since the outbreak of the Ukraine war, the word negotiation itself has kind of been blacklisted. And I'm serious, some people have lost their jobs over it, and I'm one of them. Or transition jobs over it, let's put it that way. It's in the military, it's associated with concessions, and conceding implies weakness. For the military, negotiations begin when the military is finished, and there's little dialogue between military leaders and decision makers about using force as an instrument of power or as a tool to support a larger negotiation environment as envisioned by Bill. So from a mutually hurting stalemate perspective, obviously, if you want to induce that scenario, you have to be able to adjust those levels of influence. And for that to happen, and for military strategy to work, it cannot be disconnected from political ends. So when I worked in Germany, for instance, I was asked with some of my colleagues to advise General Cavoli about future security threats in the European theater, while I was focusing on sort of leverage and posture of the larger diplomatic process with allies and partners, my colleague, who was a historian, military historian, explained that based on his historical analysis, Putin would use tactical nuclear weapons within 3 months, and that was basically certain. I'm glad that didn't happen. But it was interesting because after that, I was so frustrated. I walked back to my office and I called Bill just to share and like voice my frustration. So that gets me to the last part, I promise, which is the WWZD of what would Zartman do. Being brilliant to the end, he understood, as so many of you have mentioned, that we had entered this more zero-sum and uncompromising bargaining era. But I think, and I also think he was frustrated that decades of wisdom and expertise were being ignored, as if no longer relevant in today's hard power environment. After Iran was attacked, when I sat with him, one of the last conversations or times I saw him, he urged for, or he argued for urgent negotiation. He said, we've taken out the nuclear sites. Okay, I think that was probably the only alternative. But his famous, now what? Now is the time to pressure Iran to accept an agreement, to find a formula that can guide the talks. He specifically asked me if I thought there were any senior advisors in the current administration who understood this imperative, reminding us that time is of essence, stressing that political processes must follow any show of force. So, from my perspective, in the defense world, there's this profound need for better analysis on how especially military incentives or disincentives must complement a political strategy when dealing with other international actors, either as adversaries or allies. His legacy, I think, challenges us to bridge the divide between academia and practice, and to bring our negotiation analysis back into the heart of decision-making, and to never lose sight of the power of dialogue, even and especially in a world where hard power seems to dominate. I was really, really happy about a year ago to engage him actually in what might have been one of his last sort of large public engagements. And it was a conference that we had, the DSCU, on security cooperation. And one of the things, and it was a room full of security sort of researchers. And one of the things he said was, don't silo yourselves. And I'm almost done. He said, he basically said, you should be non-disciplinary. You should break down the silos and use every social science tool available to tackle today's complex problems. So, final words, let's make negotiation cool again.
Thank you. Next, we'll hear from Marco Boggero. Marco?
Thank you, Terry, and thank you for inviting me here. It's a great honor, and it's been an honor to be part of the Hopkins community and of the PhD community. I'm an African Studies major, so not a conflict negotiation. And I'm going to start with a story and end with a story, an anecdote. My first story was the meeting I had with Bill to discuss my prospectus. And I had completely forgotten until a few days ago when I was looking into my email that I wanted to focus entirely on Sudan. Relevant at the time, relevant today, we're reading the news, relevant for a number of reasons. The R2P, as Ambassador Crocker mentioned, as Terence mentioned, continues to be relevant. I was on a panel a few years ago with the UN Special Rapporteur on the R2P, so this is really something that has remained into the architecture. But the crux of the meeting was, are you sure you really want to spend several years on Sudan? And so I think that Peter more or less was saying the same things, because a few days later I emailed to thank him, and I said, following the intuition of Professor Lewis, I'm going to take up 2 case studies on Western Africa. Thank you for the intuition, Professor Lewis. That was actually good to have a broader comparative angle. And in that instance, I managed to prepare my travel to Western Africa. I managed to have a gig to travel to Sierra Leone through the World Bank. And that was in the middle of the Ebola pandemic, outbreak actually, not a pandemic. Great experience. I'd rather not do it again, but it was certainly a learning. And it also helped me to part of the work that I have continued to do on the side of global health. So that was part of the wise advising that he gave, perspective, the area scholar, certainly great interest for Sudan, but also, try to take a broader approach. And in fact, I ended up using a lot of the regime theory, the Spector and Zartman work on regime theory that brings together international law and international organization, creating a variable that really allows you to speak about dynamics of security in Africa, but then also enlarging to initiatives that are global and that have different drivers. And in that context, I was really grateful that I could work both with a realist, but also have Peter's intuition on the constructivist side and on the political economy. And I managed to then reconnect to aspects of this work, either working on conflict with the UN World Bank report on conflict, working on the regulations, part of the new safeguards of the World Bank, and several other aspects. Finally, an anecdote from many conversations we had with Bill about mercenaries and pirates. We would joke about both being pirates and sailors, because in fact early in the career we were both Navy officers, and when you finish your service you are given the ceremonial sword, and he kept his ceremonial sword framed with a pen in his office, and he would show you that with great pride, telling you, the pen is always mightier than the sword, and he really kept to this word with a great sense of humor. And some of you may know that his sailboat was called I Will, and then his second sailboat was called I Will Too, T-O-O. So thank you for inviting me here.
Thank you, Marco. Next, we will hear from Sabine Hedderberg. Sabine?
Thanks. Is this on? Oh, okay. Thanks. Yeah, I also just wanted to say what an honor it is to be here, and to really thanks to Nisa and Isabel for organizing this. This has been really terrific. So I was an MA student at SAIS in the conflict management program under Dr. Zartman from 2006 to 2008. And then I returned to SAIS to complete my PhD in 2012, focusing on the Maghreb and North Africa. So I worked with Professor Lewis and Professor Zartman. And today I still work on North Africa. And I too, just in thinking about all the things I took away from those years working with Dr. Zartman, came up with 3 kind of lessons. The first is from the field trip that we took, the conflict management field trip that I was on in January 2008 to Northern Ireland, to study the conflict there and the process that got to the Good Friday Agreement that had been reached 10 years earlier. That was my first time seeing Dr. Zartman's dedicated leadership of students and also his intrepid pursuit of understanding conflict in action. So I really learned many lessons on that trip, but the main one that I always remember is when he told us about the importance of asking clear and direct questions. We had all seen his to-the-point style being modeled in his speaking and in his writing, But I just remember that trip, getting that guidance so explicitly and kind of up close. You know, still applies, finding myself in similar meetings with political leaders where everybody wants, you know, a piece of their input, how important that is all the time. I've also been thinking about Dr. Zartman recently and what he taught me, because one of the conflicts from the region that I work on, which is officially a 50-year-old conflict, and it is, you know, its roots go back even deeper than that, but was described as stagnant for many years, is kind of reemerging. So this is the issue of the Western Sahara. It's a conflict that possibly many of you have never even heard of because it was so kind of dormant. But I have realized as I work on it that, like all conflicts, or the more I work on it, like all conflicts, how laden with emotion and biases it is for those who are involved. To give you a sense, it's sometimes described as Africa's last colony. It's also connected to countries with Arab populations, so for better or worse, it's likened to Palestine. So what I have taken from Dr. Zartman's rich work on approaching conflict is the importance of coming in with curiosity. I think that's been important for sort of examining my own biases and trying to present clear-eyed analysis. And then the third memory and lesson is back in Northern Ireland, and just that move, you know, reminds us how his work touched every corner of the globe, from this sparsely populated desert territory to the more chilly urban environment. So we were there for a week, and on that Sunday morning, I was the only person who took him up on his invitation to accompany him to church. So that hour was really special because I got to share something that I think was important to him in his personal life, and because I got his, you know, his dedicated attention for a little bit, but also just because of the importance of tasting the local flavor of the places that you're trying to understand, because I still find it very intimidating to work on countries that are so far away, and, you know, environments that are so different from what I know personally. But, you know, generally what I remember and have always retained from working with Dr. Zartman is the power of approaching those kinds of issues with humility and passion, and to just give them a try.
Thank you very much. Let me just conclude with one little anecdote, I think, about the program that was, I think, particularly important to me. And I think one of the most interesting and significant innovations that Bill Zartman made in the teaching about international conflict management was the creation of these annual field trips, which we took every year, pictures of which you are seeing behind you here all the time. I had an opportunity to lead 8 of those with Bill, and then 2 afterwards. One of the most interesting ones, we went twice to Mindanao in the Philippines, and on the second trip to Mindanao, we went to the jungle camp of the leadership of the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, where, don't tell anyone if there's anyone here from the FBI, both Bill and I were made honorary generals in the MILF. But right afterwards, I was asked actually to give a talk to a group of several hundred recruits for the MILF about what it would mean to transition from being a guerrilla army to contributing to peace when the peace agreement, which was about to be signed, was signed. So it was an opportunity for us and our students, indeed, to actually see peace being made on the ground. On our flight back to Manila, we actually were flying back with all of the leadership of the MILF to Manila, who were going to Manila to sign the peace agreement that brought an end essentially to the civil war between the MILF and the government of the Philippines. And for students of conflict management, to see a peace process that was actually unfolding in front of our very eyes was a very unique feature of everything that Bill did and that he created in the conflict management program here, for which I think all of the students who had the opportunity to participate in those activities, and certainly I as an opportunity to participate with him in leading some of these activities, was one of the most significant aspects of my academic career as well. And I'm always grateful to Bill Zartman for bringing this approach to the study of conflict management. Thank you all for attending. Isabel, I think, has a couple of announcements.
So we're going to have the Zartman family join us via Zoom. So whenever you're ready, we're ready for you.
Yes, thank you, Isabel. I want to thank everyone for being here, and especially thanks to the wonderful friends who participate in this all-inclusive symposium to honor William's life and work. A special thanks to Sinisha Vuskovic, who has stepped into continuing William's work in teaching conflict management. I would like to recognize Isabel Taipelong for her incredible energy and dedication in organizing today's event. Let me say a few words about my incredible husband. William's life for 50 years was focused on his students. They were his priority. He loved to teach. Many of his students are probably here today. When he retired from SAIS in 2008, he was interviewed by Anna Yukanonov from the SAIS Observer, who asked William the following question: do you have a teaching philosophy? William answered,
Okay,
well,
I found this on the web for William. Check it out.
well, material is important. I am continually working to communicate it effectively. What is particularly good about SAIS is that we are teaching a living subject. I am training students to either put the material into practice and use it, or research it and take the concept further. Actually, I will step all the way back. My job is to make a better world, which means I have to teach people to do what I have been able to do and use it, do it better. I want a student of mine to be better than me. There is a quote from Isaiah where a guy says, bemoaning his life, I am no better than my ancestors. I think this is an horrible statement. If we are no better than the past, the world is not going to progress. But with all his former students present this afternoon, I think the world is progressing. I will now introduce my son, Alexander, who will read a poem that William dedicated to his students.
First of all, thank you to all the distinguished guests who took the time out of their day to attend this memorial to my father. I'm deeply grateful and appreciative of the commentary and analysis I heard today. It's odd sitting at his desk that he sat at for the last 45 years. And it's moving to hear the impact of my father's work and how it continues to shape approaching problems and theories based on the facts on the ground and not just theoretical gymnastics, but real boots on the ground. I was also struck by the number of photos of my father's travels to areas of conflict and his inclination to wear a mask. Many of you may not know, but my father collected masks. He loved wearing them at Halloween. But his office is suffused with masks on nearly every wall. Why? It occurred to me listening today that perhaps there was a reason. Maybe a reason that my father never even realized. I will reference two authors that had a deep impact on me in my youth: Albert Camus and Ralph Ellison. Camus had a quote: "Travel breaks down a kind of inner structure we have. Stripped of our props, deprived of our masks, we are completely on the surface of ourselves. Perhaps it is when we travel and deprive ourselves of our masks. Not only are we completely on the surface of ourselves, but it is then that perhaps we are ripe for resolution." Ralph Ellison spoke to us about, quote, wearing the mask, a metaphor for hiding one's true identity or emotions to survive societal prejudice, and that the invisible man represents the feeling of being unseen or unrecognized. My father was someone who spent his life trying to represent those that felt unseen or unrecognized. And that perhaps is why masks meant so much to him. One could wear the mask, but once, as Camus said, you were deprived of the mask, then we are completely on the surface of ourselves, and thus ripe for hope and ripe for resolution. So on that note, I wish to share one stanza of a poem that my father wrote to be read at his funeral. When I die, I want no grieving. I want my students to celebrate, to build on my teachings in theory and practice, and do better than I to improve the human fate. Thank you.
I don't know if the camera is going to pick me up, but thank you to the final panel, but thank you to Madam Zartman, Alex Zartman, for sharing your thoughts, for joining us, albeit virtually. It's very hard to follow up now after such moving words, but this entire event was meant to motivate, inspire, engage, based on the ideas and ideals that Bill Zartman was sharing with all of us. His legacy continues, his legacy endures, his legacy intimidates, and his legacy inspires. And I'm privileged to be part of a community that somehow, somewhere, at one point was termed Zartmaniacs. And I think it's a fitting term of how much he meant to all of us, both on an interpersonal level, intellectual level, practical level. I would just like to take the opportunity to conclude the event, also by demystifying one, I think, pressing issue that came out of all of these panels. So what is the final count of Professor Zartman's publication track record. And I actually have the number because I was helping him keep updated his CV for various reasons. So the final count is truly intimidating. And as you will see, it is 17 authored and co-authored monographs. It is 36 edited volumes or co-edited volumes. It is 14 special issues, editorial roles. It is 53 peer-reviewed articles. It is 102 book chapters in edited volumes. It is 17 expert policy reports, and which amounts to 238 and counting, because I'm proud to say that his legacy continues. There is a number of projects that are still going on. I'm proud to say that I'm working on completing one as we speak, timely labeled governing as negotiations to resonate with what some other panels were talking about, and is going to come out in the negotiation journal as a special issue. And there are multiple special issues being prepared in his honor that will be available soon, and will be a way to honor his legacy, but also to move it further. With a special thanks to Isabel Talpine-Long, the backbone of conflict management for years, for organizing this and for letting me be part of this. I would like to call this event to an end, to invite you to the reception afterwards, and to once again thank Zartman family for allowing us to honor Bill Zartman's legacy in this way. Thank you all very, very much.